Thank you all for coming in person and the folks online. I'm very pleased to be here on the podium today with the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, Dr. Radha Iyengar Plumb, the Defense Industrial Acquisition Group here at CSIS. Always enjoys bringing in guests who can weigh in on key issues of the day, and Dr. Plumb is really well placed for that, so welcome. I will give a little background and bio of Dr. Plumb, and then I will turn to her for some opening remarks, and then we'll have a Q&A session with opportunity for the audience, both in person and online, to ask questions. In her role as part of senior DoD leadership, Dr. Plumb is responsible for all acquisition issues, including contract administration, logistics, material readiness, the defense industrial base, and the workforce that supports it. She is also responsible for installations in the environment, operational energy, and chemical, biological, and nuclear defense. Before serving in this role, Dr. Plumb was Chief of Staff to the Deputy Secretary of Defense and Acting Deputy Director of Administration and Management. She held leadership positions at both Google and Facebook, was a senior economist for the RAND Corporation, and worked at both the Department of Energy and the National Security Council, so a very impressive background. Dr. Plumb also holds a PhD in economics from Princeton University and formerly taught at the London School of Economics and at Harvard. She has kindly agreed to offer some opening remarks, so over to you, Dr. Plumb.
Well, thank you, Cynthia. I feel like I should pass you some money under the table or something for that introduction. But before we don't do that in the Department of Defense, just to be very clear. So before we dive into details on how we're getting after some of the areas I know folks want to talk about, like speeding capability delivery and our acquisition professionals courses, I want to touch a little bit on how we got to where we are right now, and I think that'll help set the stage for the broader conversation. So not to do a whole economic history course here, but I think it's pretty widely known that in the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, defense and R&D spending fell, and we slowed acquisition processes across a host of defense programs. Now, to be clear, there was also a broader shift in manufacturing in general, and the real difference in the defense sector is that this decline in spending was compounded by a series of mergers and acquisitions, in part to address cost pressures from the decline in spending and to aid integration of new technology into our existing platforms. So that consolidation limited our production to a few key partners in industry and focused our approaches to scale on integration, leveraging those key companies. We had the benefit of time to work those processes, right? So we have processes for integration, but they take time. And today we really face a different kind of competitor in our pacing challenge of China. So the Chinese are leveraging their state-connected enterprises to compete with the United States, not only in military realms, but also in cutting-edge technology. And it's that rapid fusion of civil and military technology that's really worrisome. So it means that the Chinese can develop civil, but also really importantly, military uses in key areas like quantum computing, hypersonics, artificial intelligence, and that allows them to further their state interests, sort of consistent with those autocratic values. But we have an economic advantage that the Chinese government doesn't. I might argue an enduring advantage from the American system, which is a vibrant, robust economic marketplace that channels freedom into creative technological solutions. So to counter China and its resources, speed is of the essence, and what we need is to bring all of our partners, all hands on deck. That means small businesses, researchers, non-traditional companies, emerging technology developers, and of course our traditional defense sector primes. Across the board, the Department of Defense has made really great progress over the last 5 to 10 years when it comes to prototyping. And what we're really focused on now is getting that innovation, those new technologies, to produce at scale in the right time frame. And to counter China's whole of nation approach, what we need to do is what only the American system can do, which is let industry iterate and develop while we in the government create the conditions to rapidly scale those key technologies. And that's the secret sauce. And I want to lay out a little bit of what we're doing to deliver those capabilities to our warfighters quickly, but most importantly at scale. So let me just bucket things into 3 categories, and that'll let us talk a little bit more about it as we go forward. First bucket is we are and need to do more to use all of our acquisition tools and authorities. So the adaptive acquisition framework, which folks might be familiar with, was a good step, and building on that, at the individual program level, we're employing everything from MTAs and OTAs to the software acquisition pathway to create a range of hybrid strategies that enable scale. The key is we want to do that deliberately, focused first and foremost on the challenge we're trying to solve and the end result. So we don't want this to just be about more OTAs. It's really about leveraging all of these authorities to scale capabilities. One approach we're taking to do that is what we're calling the Competitive Advantage Pathfinders Initiative inside of ANS. What do? We identify high tech-ready capabilities that meet a warfighter need, and then we see where the sticking points are when we try to just rapidly push it to scale. Are there resource issues, policies issues? Are there authorities, integration gaps? And we develop a solution for that problem and keep going and solve the next issue and the next issue and the next issue. That lets us do two things. It lets us accelerate that specific technology, but also identify where we need to improve things to speed scale more generally. Our first 6 Pathfinders are all delivering capabilities within 2 years and accelerating those deliveries by an average of 2 to 4 years. Let me give a concrete example. The Navy and Air Force are developing a capability that can miniaturize a ship-based electronic attack module called a Medusa for use in an aircraft. The time from funding availability through development completion of the capability, called Pegasus, is estimated to be about 18 months now, 3 years ahead of schedule. And a wide array of DoD platforms with antenna configurations are immediate candidates to benefit from this new scaled capability, which can deliver situational awareness and electronic attack functions. The second bucket is closely related to the first one, and that's figuring out where we can reduce barriers to integration. So inside of ANS, we stood up this acquisition integration interoperability team, and their job is to align service-specific systems acquisition to meet joint requirements. So what does that mean? That office runs what we call an integrated acquisition portfolio review. It takes a capability and a mission thread and really looks at the underlying service-specific programs, identifies where there are gaps or seams, areas that we need investment for integration, and focuses on identifying resources for that integration with particular focus on year of execution funding. The idea here is to establish faster, better processes to connect prototype contracts to production contracts, to scale integration, to ensure that our joint requirements are met. We're also connecting that to leveraging outreach through infrastructure like our Apex accelerators. So we have a number of hubs around the countries that are targeted at small and mid-sized businesses. An example of programs the hub's office offer are things like Project Spectrum, which provides training to small and medium-sized businesses across the federal manufacturing supply chain to improve cybersecurity readiness and resilience. The idea here is to reduce barriers to entry and increase security and compliance all at one time. The third bucket, and then I'll wrap up, is the workforce. And look, none of this happens without the right people in the right places. So we're going to probably dive into this more as we talk, but I'll just start by saying that we're really focused on this end to end. So we're looking at expanding recruitment through programs like our Defense Civilian Training Corps, on building more modular innovation-focused training. That's work going on at DAU, and at how we can create the right kind of incentives to do that innovative work, encouraging the right kind of risk-taking. So the goal of all 3 of these buckets is a calibration of the processes and workforce to ensure that the door for new entrants in the defense marketplace is open, and there's a concierge of sorts waiting on the other side to help guide the purveyors of that critical technology across to success. The bottom line, though, is collectively, whether in government or our partners in industry or in research, we have to be all in what we're doing, and we all need to do what we can do best. And we have to do it with a relentless sense of urgency to move the national levers at the speed our warfighters need. So let me pause there, Cynthia, and sort of turn it back to you for broader questions.
Thank you. Those are really interesting topics and hit on all the questions that I had prepared. So I'm glad that we're in alignment on this. Really, the first question I had was asking for industry folks in the audience, what can they expect from ANS in terms of big picture, acquisition reform type initiatives to improve the government's ability to engage effectively with industry? You talked about some specific initiatives. Are you pulling these together in a big picture or working to instantiate them and process in any particular ways? Do you view these as experiments? How can we pull this effort forward?
So let me kind of start pulling back a little to say, in the department, we always kind of balancing these twin goals, right, of delivering integrated capabilities at speed to our warfighters, but also of being good stewards of taxpayer dollars. I give that frame to say, we actually have had a lot of acquisition reform over the last few years. We have a number of new authorities, expanded other transaction authorities, middle tier authorities, software pathways. What we're looking for in the department isn't really big changes, big policy reforms. What we're really looking at is how we can streamline, connect those different authorities and pathways into hybrid processes that can speed us more effectively. So I like to joke I'm a little ideas person, and the idea is to put the things together kind of back to back to get us beyond just innovation and prototype and really connect the prototype and design part to the production and scale, really leveraging more agile sprints, iterative processes, and that I think can help us get to scale more effectively. I will note there are a couple areas where we have identified the need for new authorities. One good example is the Air Force has a proposal for year of execution, new starts up to a preliminary design review level of maturity for tech. So that allows us to, for things that are in the budget that we're planning and funding for, but where appropriations maybe haven't quite passed yet, that we can begin the process of the prototyping, the tech readiness, so that once we get to year of execution, when we're in the budget year and appropriations are passed, we can, we've got a running start to continue making progress.
Where does that effort stand?
It's over with Congress.
Okay. So
Supported
TBD.
by, TBD,
TBD,
but supported by the administration. And, Congress has been really great partners for us in the acquisition community in terms of giving us a range of authorities and tools to use to get after the problem. So we'll hope that trend continues.
Okay, good. So getting back to acquisition process, I heard a set of efforts and initiatives to accelerate, packages of programs, types of programs, and that just reminds me that some analysts say that acquisition reform really isn't necessary, that the FAR is written in a very flexible way, and that program managers can flexibly apply it to the systems that they're acquiring. So that seems like your efforts are trying to take advantage of that flexibility. Can you reflect on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's right. Look, I think if you think about the types of tools we have available, we have FAR-based contracts. We have examples of programs where we've taken some of our new authorities, MTAs, and applied them to help us get through the prototyping phase, really get advanced design and transition them to the program of record. A good example there is the Army's M10 Booker combat vehicle, which utilized the MTA on the prototype side and then went into the major capabilities pathway. So we certainly have examples of that, but also we have more tools, and now it's a matter of putting those together in the right order to get things from prototype and delivery up through scale, and that's really, I think, where we are now in this sort of arc of discussion here.
So I had several questions on the workforce that I had later in my list, but I'd like to address one of them on this. To do all of the programs in a flexible and effective way does require a well-trained and empowered acquisition workforce that is willing to take risk, that doesn't think that they're going to go to jail if they do something. I've heard it all over the years. So can you tell us about how you're trying to encourage the acquisition workforce to take advantage of the authorities that they have to support their ability to do this? Because that seems like it's really key to getting these new innovative capabilities.
Yeah, so let me take that in a couple of pieces. Let me start with our existing workforce, and I'll work backwards to sort of how we're thinking about recruitment. Okay, existing workforce. I'll start by I'd be remiss if I didn't say, whatever the workforce is, they are deeply affected by things like government shutdown and lack of appropriation. So part of this is making sure we have a clear signal to our workforce that, you know, funding the government and funding the Department of Defense is an actual priority, and that allows us to retain the critical part of the workforce we need. So I'm just going to bucket that to the side and say, within our acquisition community, we're actually working through a number of newer approaches, reducing the total amount of credential hours needed in terms of the basic training, and then building what we're thinking of as training modules, we call them playlists, that are focused in key areas to build awareness and expertise on the new authorities, but also then case studies, examples drawn, for instance, from our competitive advantage pathfinders, that acquisition professionals can use to learn not just the rules, but the how. How do people approach the problem solving, and how can that be scaled? The next step of that is then taking some of our existing programs, things like our workforce fund, DADA, working with the services and how they apply that, to make sure we're applying the incentives and rewards for folks both taking those courses and applying what they've learned, to kind of pull that string all the way across from training, awareness, training and understanding, and then incentives for performance, right? So that's kind of the arc we're trying to build in with much more modular and easy to update training courses available through DAU. Two other pieces that aid that along. First is on the just getting new ideas in and out. We have the public partnership transfer exchange program. It's not really an exchange, it's more of an experience for some of our workforce to be able to go out to private sector partners and come back in. But some of that iterative process of seeing different systems, different designs, different approaches to risk in terms of management in business settings, in program management, and in procurement, I think is a really important part of bringing new ideas through the cycle here. The last piece I just note is we're working on kind of bringing in the generation of the future. That has two advantages for us. First, we just need a continuous acquisition and sustainment workforce to continue doing the work, but also brings in a new audience, right? Digital natives, people who are much more familiar with a range of the software-enabled systems we're talking about. And we have a couple of different programs there. I mentioned DCTC, the Defense Civilian Training Corps, which is essentially like ROTC for civilians, focused on the acquisition community, and we're running a pilot in several universities now to see how that fares and to see kind of how that translates into take up into federal service. And we also have a number of summer internship programs that are aimed at trying to bring in, expose to a newer audience the range of roles in the acquisition and sustainment communities. And so that, I think, allows us to sort of end-to-end from the existing workforce to new entrants, try to build a cadre of folks that are comfortable with the types of programs we're talking about, and then incentivized to take that comfort in the tools we give them to speed along that acquisition process.
Okay, that makes sense. And I would agree with you on the importance of the acquisition workforce. And working in this field for 25 years, I have met so many committed, hardworking individuals who have really tried to push against perceived bureaucracy to get good work done. And DAU does have a number of good, promising examples on its, and instructive examples on its website, so I would commend those to the audience as well. So we have talked so far about the DoD side of the house, what's happening inside the department, how you're working to accelerate capabilities, how you're building your workforce. Let's talk a little bit about industry itself. DoD works hard to bring non-traditional suppliers and innovators into the defense ecosystem, to keep it fresh, to bring in new innovation, and has put together a number of organizations and processes that are focused on locating, finding, and onboarding new entrants like DIU, the SIBR programs, AFWorks, NavalX, and so forth. So what is your vision for these? Where do we have this large ecosystem of organizations doing this. Is it necessary to have so many? Do they have very different goals here? What are the next steps for these organizations to reach out to innovators and to bring them on to support the Department of Defense?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I don't think I'll break any news by saying our funding timelines and processes can be cumbersome and opaque in the Department of Defense. So, in some ways, having the DIUs, the AFWERX, and NavalXs are really critical front door for innovators to come to with folks who speak their language. The question is, like always, well, I only really have one question, and it's always the same question, which is how do we scale that? And in the case of I'll start with the DIUs, the AFWERX, and then I'll come to the kind of contract vehicles, things like SBIR. What we need to be able to do is figure out for folks who come into those doors and who have capabilities, emerging tech capabilities that really match critical warfighters' needs, that we have a way to help them sort of traverse this transom that is the prototype and experimentation world to the really bigger dollar, longer term contracts that allow scale, right? And that's like kind of the name of the game here. So what are we doing inside the department? We basically have three sort of lines of effort here. The first is we have to better connect the companies and the customers. So that means our requirements documents, which are long and tedious, need to be more digitized. They need to be accessible and searchable so that our warfighters can help connect their own needs to those requirements in an understandable way. Then we need to connect the companies with the tech to those requirements and the problem statements we're hearing from warfighters, and connect that to the right PEOs and acquisition professionals who can bring those to scale. And that's where ANS can be helpful, which is the DIUs can identify those companies with capabilities and can even identify, and here, Doug Beck is, I think, doing great work in Indo-PACOM, for instance, the new director of DIU, in connecting that warfighter capability to what they're hearing from companies. What we need now is to help connect that piece to the PEOs to help ride alongside those commercial innovations or those commercial adapted innovations to figure out what is a hybrid strategy. How do we put together those MTAs and prototype tools and then program of records or software pathways to create a meaningful acquisition process at scale? The last piece I'll just say here, which is we're not going to get this right on any one thing or any one time, right? This is going to be iterative, it's going to be incremental, but it's going to make progress. And so we have to be assessing ourselves in real time. And so some of what we're looking at is the data and those transitions. How many prototype OTAs are connecting to production OTAs? What are we looking at in terms of timeline? And a lot of our CAP program is that on, okay, what are the barriers? How much does that shorten the timeline by? Where are we seeing kind of high bang for our buck in leadership investment, in policy changes, and how can we kind of find the next thing like that and the next thing and the next thing? And that sort of iterative, continuous improvement is really what drives progress.
Yeah, so just that is a great overview. And just the flip side of that, there's the I don't want to call them complaints because that sounds negative, but areas for improvement that I hear from companies, large and small, include things like, these programs like OTAs are great, but there's no transparency on how they transition to programs of record, so we don't know if it's worthwhile competing for them. We don't have a sense of whether the juice is worth the squeeze, what the government thinks they're going to be, how they're going to be developing them. I've heard, if any of these organizations like DIU or AFWERX or, NavalX worked, they wouldn't need so many of them. So real challenges from industry side about working for the department. I mean, do you hear these complaints from industry?
Oh, yes. So, look, I think I will start from the premise that there are a lot of areas of improvement, and in the department, kind of our approach, and in this administration really, from the deputy secretary and the secretary on down, the approach is let's just find a problem, fix that problem, and get after the next one and the next one. The DIUs and the AFWERX and the NavalX, we saying we have too many of them while at the same time saying we don't have enough ways for companies to connect is a little, sort of on both sides. But what I will say is that ecosystem of sort of innovative, government-connected but almost forward deployed elements is a real critical front door for us. And I think what I hear a lot reflected in those comments and that frustration is that those doors connect to an unknown hallway. Mm-hmm. And we need to do a better job of explaining what the hallway is and what's at the end of it, right? And that's really where we're focused in A&S, which is what's the hallway, what's the pathway, is there a PEO at the end of this? Does it need to be a program of record? Can it go from a prototype to a production contract in a way that leverages some of the other sort of newer authorities we have? And what does the timeline for those look like, right? And I think all of those questions are ones that need to get fleshed out on the eaches on specific technologies, which is kind of our CAPS approach, this competitive advantage pathfinders. And then in the sort of at the higher level in the overall hybrid strategies, and that's really what we're trying to do with DAU in terms of building these training modules for acquisition professionals who we can then connect in and explain what pathway options are.
So I love hearing that answer, and I love your touching on the word ecosystem, because, you know, as I listen to you talk about all the different efforts that you have underway, it's very clear to me that you don't view this as here's the problem and here's the solution and here's how we're going to fix it, but instead this is a very complex environment. We know what we want, and there's a lot of work on how to get there.
Yeah.
And so you've identified workforce, you've identified processes, you've identified connecting with industry, you've identified improving transparency and supporting transition to producing at scale, making more profits, programs of record. Did I leave anything out? What are the other efforts you have underway?
I think the other two things I guess I would say is, you know, really rethinking how we connect where prototype production and design fit in that, right? So we want to compress and really break down we prototype and experiment for a while, and now we produce, and then that is the end, and we produce at scale and then keep that thing for 50 or 60 years. It's not how a lot of technology is now. And so that's one big area that we are working on, breaking down that cycle, working with our partners in the Chief Digital and AI Office and some of the work they're doing, working with the services there. And the other piece that we've just touched on is this piece on integration, which is, you know, one value added we can offer in A&S is in a world where we are focused on joint capabilities, but really rely on the services for their Title 10 man, train, equip responsibilities. We owe it to the acquisition ecosystem on the A&S side to make sure that we're providing that lens of where are there potential seams or areas that capabilities across the services need to integrate to deliver for our co-coms, for our warfighters, and how can we help enable that?
Yeah, I think that's very wise, recognizing that part of acquisition management is managing the seams and connecting folks on different sides. One of the issues of more rapid onboarding of new capabilities is that the department is really traditionally set up to be very thoughtful about every stage of acquisition. And it's very easy to point to fingers and say, oh my gosh, they're so slow, what's taking them so long? But really, when you break down what the acquisition process includes, it includes things like writing tech manuals so the warfighters know how to use them, and extensive T&E processes. So in terms of innovation and rapid onboarding of new capabilities, how are you rethinking that system as a whole to ensure that you're onboarding system without onboarding new capabilities without taking on too much risk?
That's a great question. Let me answer that in two ways. One is some areas we're just going to have to agree to take on more risk than we do traditionally, and that's kind of the pressure of time. And that doesn't mean run with scissors and fall down the stairs, but it does mean being very cognizant of the time pressures that we are under and the integration requirements, and being very clear about those risks and deciding when to take them. So there's a bucket of just, are we making sure we take the right risks and making sure our workforce is empowered to identify those risks and that our senior leaders are willing to make the decision. But there's also a range of kind of, can we incorporate some of that in some of the the long lead items into our process. Testing and evaluation is a great example. Software driven systems, that testing and evaluation environments and what testing and evaluation actually delivers is not a discrete single point in time activity, nor is the maintenance, the sustainment, if you will, of that software capability. So figuring out what testing and evaluation looks like in some of those software or hybrid software hardware capabilities, what the training and what the testing and evaluation looks like, and what the training looks like, and where those timelines can be compressed, iterated on, sort of delivery and integration can be aligned. Those are all areas that we're looking at in terms of how we can shorten the overall timeline from we've got a high tech readiness, a tech that meets a warfighter need, to we've got a warfighter with the capability. And so all of the steps along that, we're looking where it's compressible and what the risk is.
So I think a lot of us, when we think about acquisition, we think about stuff, airplanes or, tanks, ships, submarines. If we get into the digital world, can you talk a little bit about how you're trying to manage that? What is distinct about it? Where are there opportunities? Where are there particular challenges?
Yeah, so let me start with, the digital world is all around us. And I mean that somewhat facetiously, but also quite literally, which is we have a number of digital capabilities that are their own capabilities we want to deliver and manage and think about. We have a range of digital and software-enabled capabilities that relate to our hardware that need to get integrated with them. And then we have sort of the trade-off between digital and hardware solutions as we try to solve problems, electronic warfare being a nice example of where sometimes software, sometimes physical hardware can add resilience, and thinking about where the right investments can be made there. So I say all of that to say that we have to kind of think about this in a holistic sense about what is the problem, what is the capability we're trying to solve, and then how do we deliver it. Now, we have new tools now, right? And software often, leaving aside the sustainment maintenance side, but the software development itself can be both shorter time frame and lower in a Department of Defense, though not in a total dollar value sense. And so that means things like for our software acquisition pathway, I think we have about just under 40 programs and a little over $3 billion in spend there, right? So that's like pretty good value in terms of delivering in a good number of capabilities that we're doing there. And so the question is there more we can be doing with the software pathway? And that's a question we're kind of constantly asking ourselves. But also, is that software pathway as a hybrid approach to other kind of pathways, other ways of funding, allowing us to get at some of that integration work that needs to happen with some of our legacy programs or even some of our newer hardware, and where can those different pathways, different acquisition enablers ride alongside each other to allow us to parallel track things rather than sequentially build them.
So taking advantage of what they offer.
Right.
All right, I had a few more questions, and my questions were so brilliant that I'm seeing them also being asked by our digital audience. So I will give credit to the folks who are asking these next set of questions. Some of which are aligning with what we're talking about, and some of which are on new topics. So the first one is, and we'll turn to folks in the room as well. For the questions online, I can cut them down, but if you're in the room asking a question, please just keep it short so that we can get as many questions in the remaining 20 minutes as we possibly can. So this first question is from Dylan Harris with NHK Japan Broadcasting Corporation, who is asking about AUKUS.
Okay.
Can you speak about the AUKUS trade authorization mechanism and its importance to the success of the pact overall? In particular, Dylan is curious about the risks if the international traffic in arms regulations or ITAR regulations are not exempted for AUKUS. What's the discussions going on for that?
Yeah, so let me pull us back a little bit to give a little bit of context on AUKUS. So AUKUS is a tremendously important initiative launched by this administration to try to build capability along with allies and partners, a key part of our national defense strategy, with a particular focus on the Indo-Pacific. The way AUKUS has been structured is, the initial pillar focused on submarines, and actually the Undersecretary will be talking here on a range of Navy issues, I think in just a couple weeks. So the initial pillar focused on submarines, but we have a range of emerging tech we're working on with them. In that context, things like how we deal with export control, how we deal with technology risks are at the forefront of the conversation. But let's be really clear, that's not the only place they're at the forefront of the conversation. We're having that conversation in Ukraine. We have that conversation routinely with allies and partners. And this is a place where we have a combination of solutions, and the question is how we want to think about the different risks we want to trade off and how that trades off with time. So there are versions where we talk about how hard is it to build an exportable version of this, an alternative version of this type of technology, and what does that production solution look like? And that's a conversation with industry partners. There's a question of what kinds of modifications can be made to the particular technology or particular issue, and that's really a within the government R&D and technologist question. There's a question on, are we willing to take on some risk to export this to a particular ally or partner in a particular context? And that's really a policy conversation. And again, returning to the sort of premise, our focus is how do we deliver those capabilities at speed and scale, and looking at all of the solutions available to us, how do we trade off the different risks and benefits of those to get to the right point on a case-by-case basis. And that's exactly what we're doing in AUKUS across the range of emerging capabilities we're talking about within the partnership.
Yeah, I know that ITAR is often criticized for the delays it causes, but it's there for a purpose. Is there a time frame for any announcements that we can expect on how we'll be working with the Australians on ITAR or on other issues regarding AUKUS?
I don't know that there's a particular,
Okay.
let me put it this way, I'm not aware of any particular announcement forthcoming. I think we are kind of continuing to work with Australia and the UK on how we can make progress in this issue, both in the range of projects and in the sort of solutions we can have to managing some of the risks.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a related question, which comes from our friend Jerry McGinn with the Baroni Center at GMU. And he writes in that Ukraine has shown the capacity challenges in the defense industrial base. Part of the solution is increasing production capacity, which has been a major focus of the department, of course. And there is also additional capacity possible by collaborating with allies and partners, which has been central for 155 millimeter artillery shells and other systems. What is the department doing to spur increased international industrial collaboration more broadly?
Well,
there is, if we want to reinvigorate the arsenal of democracy, working with allies and partners could be a big piece of this.
Yeah, so let me start with saying, I think Ukraine is sort of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's shown some fragility in the industrial base and sort of focused on production in the US and abroad. On the other hand, it's shown what the true value of allies and partners and a concerted focus can do, and the amount of munitions combined with, frankly, the Ukrainians' tremendous courage and will has just delivered amazing effects. So yes, I want to talk about scaling production and to come to that, but I don't want to miss the forest for the trees that we've got an international community that's delivering billions of dollars of weapons on a moment's notice in response to an unprovoked attack, and the Ukrainians are kind of going toe for toe, and that is truly an amazing accomplishment and speaks to the value of our alliances. On the production side, yes, we are focused domestically on where we can accelerate production, and you see that in our investments. USAI, the funding that we have domestically, about $9 billion plus replenishment funding, another about $10 billion domestically. So we're scaling our own production. With that in parallel, we have a routine engagement at the secretary level and then at the undersecretary level with both our NATO partners and then the broader sort of Ukraine Defense Coalition group, the coalition of the willing, so to speak, invested in building and supporting Ukrainian defense through the support of a range of items needed for their continued self-defense efforts. In that context, and especially with NATO, but more broadly with the UDCG, the NADS group, the National Armaments Director, have been working and focused specifically on two big kind of areas across a range of different topics. They have a range of working groups for specific munitions, but one is contracts. What are the contracts we need to get to accelerate production? And that's hot production lines in the US, but also hot production lines in our allies and partners. But the second is sort of, there's a sub-tier there that we're all cross-dependent on. And where can we coordinate for who's producing which pieces so that we're expanding the total supply chain and industrial base rather than sort of cross-relying on the same sort of ever fixed underlying set of supplies. So think propellants and energetics, tubes to fire things, not just the metal shells, but all of the other pieces you need to make meaningful munitions. And the Undersecretary himself has been, along with the Secretary of Defense, have been very specifically and in detailed ways focused on both of those issues to make systematic and demonstrable progress so that 2 to 4 years from now it will look very different in terms of total production than we look right now.
Mm-hmm. So getting more efficiencies out of working with allies and partners. So one of the lines of argument that is out in the ecosystem is that we should pull back from supporting Ukraine because it's putting us at risk if there's a conflict in the Indo-Pacific. And the counter to that is actually having this Russia's unprovoked attack in Ukraine and our support of Ukraine has shown the importance of building up the ecosystem and the industrial base in a way that we wouldn't have really understood without this pacing threat, or I'm sorry, without this conflict that's currently underway. Can you talk about how this is being viewed in the department? Because this is like a key acquisition and industrial base issue.
Sure. Let me pull us back and just anchor on the National Defense Strategy, which the administration and the Secretary released sort of early, about a year and a half ago. That really provides the roadmap, and I would say a call to action on how to make sure we can do exactly that, which is match the pacing challenge of China, make sure we're postured to respond to that, while dealing with a range of acute threats. And included in that acute threat is Russia, right? And so the reason there's a pacing challenge is because in the long term, it is only the Chinese who have the ability to match in terms of capabilities and development, but that doesn't make the acute threat irrelevant, and it doesn't mean that our posture shouldn't be set up to balance between those and address and manage risk across those across time.
Okay.
So in that context, yes, again, Ukraine, I think, revealed some fragility in our own industrial base, and that's an area that we're getting after in the department and have made real progress on over the last year and a half. And maybe we wouldn't have kind of identified exactly those areas absent the Ukrainian conflict. But I think holistically, we're not necessarily off track from anywhere we need to be, because the investments we're making more generally are intended specifically within the context of that national defense strategy to balance between these risks.
Yep, that makes sense. Thank you. If people in the room have a question, just stand behind the microphone back there. This next one I'm going to ask is, apologies for the pronunciation of the name, but Cal Bisecker with Defense Daily. He asked, how is A&S working with DOD's new replicator initiative? Why should industry be confident that DOD can meet Deputy Secretary Hicks' goal of acquiring autonomous unmanned systems within 18 to 24 months?
The deputy actually gave a speech on this last week. She provided some additional remarks earlier today at the Defense News Conference, and I would encourage folks to look at that. In it, she's very clear, Replicator isn't a new program of record, it's not new funding. What it is an approach that deals with the need to accelerate to scale rapidly. And within that context, kind of exactly what we've been talking about in terms of the competitive advantage pathfinders. There's a similar initiative on the research and engineering side called Radar that identifies promising prototypes. So really connecting that process end to end to say, here's a capability we need, what's the tech we have that can meet that capability, and now let's leverage our tools and authorities and resources to identify identify, scale, and deliver that technology. And that's kind of the challenge, but also the opportunity the deputy has posed for us as an entire sort of mission capability delivery unit in the department. And so yes, it's an acquisition part, but it's also resourcing, policy, research and engineering, and we're working together as a team to deliver on that. And I think that that is very consistent with the way in which the deputies, through the deputy secretary's leadership, the department has delivered a range of capabilities over the last 2 years, and I think we'll continue to do that and show progress as we do it.
Yeah, so that has a great name, Replicator, and it's getting a lot of attention these days. I have to guess, though, that these technologies that are announced, it's not that the department started working on Replicator last week and they're announcing it this week. Can you talk a little bit about the ecosystem of investment in fundamental capabilities that yields interesting new capabilities that may seem like they're surprises to the public, but really are the final culmination of years of work?
Yeah, I mean, look, if you go back in time over the last 3 budgets from this president, you'll see a continued commitment to research and development funding. That research and development funding isn't just, lab experiments in the background, but really the testing, development, investment, all the way through to getting a really meaningful high-tech readiness prototype. And those investments over a long period of time are what deliver a range of potential prototypes in any given mission capability area that we can then, on the acquisition side, say, what is the acquisition readiness of this? Who is the PEO? What is the pathway, right? All of those questions I said in the beginning. And same thing on the integration piece. Once we have the acquisition pathway, okay, what does this need to be integrated with? Is that a joint integration requirement or a service-specific integration requirement? How do we kind of walk our way through that? And that's something that is, it's not an overnight process, and there's no single silver bullet for it. It's the result of continued investment combined with good governance, sort of in a leadership connecting mission capabilities all the way down the chain. And that's what you've really seen over the last 2.5 years inside the department that delivers the ability to make commitments on how we can identify a mission capability need and then scale it and deliver it to a warfighter on a fixed and achievable timeline.
Yeah, it's exciting to see new programs like this come out. First question in the room?
Hi, it's Masao Dahlgren from the Missile Defense Project at CSIS. I'm really interested in the flows of private capital into the defense enterprise. And it seems that there's a lot of interest at the beginning of the process in venture capital, and at the end in terms of public markets. But how do you incentivize flows of private capital into that middle part of the acquisition pipeline? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. So just 2 thoughts here. Neither of which are going to be wholly satisfying, but it is something that is very much kind of on the mind. The first is the Secretary established the Office of Strategic Capital, which is really focused at this question strategically, what is a portfolio-based approach to kind of incenting private capital in the right stages of the process. That's a relatively nascent effort, but I think you'll be kind of seeing and hearing more about how that matching, both in terms of leveraging other authorities that exist across the federal government, as well as, frankly, just doing a better job of demand signaling out to the private capital markets. So that piece, I think, is well underway. The second piece is something that I have just talked about or alluded to, which is this integration piece. And when we talk about integration, there's a lot of opportunity there, both within the government to look at where does integration need to happen in terms of existing platforms, but also in terms of investment potential, which is where is there technology where by itself that technology has high tech readiness but can't be integrated, but with private capital investment that allows that technology to do the kinds of testing and integration work that need to happen, it's highly marketable and can transition into an existing program of record or into its own program of record or into a longer term pathway. And figuring out how, and that's kind of ongoing work we're doing in A&S with our industrial-based policy team, our integration interoperability team, and the Office of Strategic Capital, which is where is the government best poised to be that integration sort of funder, and where is it actually, should we rely on our American enduring advantage, which is the economic marketplace that actually makes those bets and does it, frankly, a lot better than the government most of the time. And that's kind of, I think, a place where we can look to make progress.
Spoken like a good Princeton economist.
Yeah.
Thank you. I know you used the word interoperability in that answer, so let me turn to a question from Jack Zavin, who is an independent consultant formerly with OSD. He asks, Dr. Plumb cited a new team that included interoperability in its name. She gave examples on integration, but nothing yet on interoperability. Can she provide some examples?
Yeah, that's a fair question. Integration and interoperability are really are integrated concepts in a sense. Mm-hmm. Part of the integration work that needs to happen, in particular on the software work, is interoperability. Mm-hmm. A lot of the work our team is doing in that AI2 office as it relates to interoperability, I alluded to, is working with, for instance, our Chief Digital and AI Officer team, yes, and more generally kind of a broader approach to modular open architecture systems that allows us to sort of think about the work that the CDAO team is doing in things like a data integration layer, which at a high level sort of ingests data and creates data products, and make sure those data products are actually available and able to connect into or interoperable with the set of systems that need to pull in that data and provide interfaces or information to warfighters. Yeah. And there's a range of work kind of in that bucket that's relevant for warfighters that focuses on the interoperability challenges of what's being delivered versus the platforms that it needs to be delivered on.
I'm glad you said modular open systems, because I was going to ask a follow-on on that. So you saved the audience that. So we'll turn to another question in the room.
Yes. Hi, I'm Colonel John Harris, 30 years in the Army, retired but still serving. Two quotes, and I'll make them brief, and one big question. This is Dr. Gansler, 40 years ago, congressional testimony. The United States is the only nation in the world that does not treat its defense industry as a critical national resource. In spite of the significant level of defense expenditures during the last 25 years, the defense industry has been allowed to deteriorate, particularly in the post-Vietnam era, so that now it is neither economically efficient in the production of military goods nor capable of responding to strategic demands for increased outputs. And it leads me into the question, how do you evaluate our surge capacity readiness? In light of the big elephant in the room, the war game simulations that this very institution conducted several months ago that determined we don't have enough missiles, munitions for 7 days of high-intensity conflict. And we've talked all around this today, but we've not talked about surge capacity. And it's been addressed time and time again for 40 years.
Thank you. I think that ties the past to the challenge we're facing in the present.
Yeah, so let me start with just a reframing, which is, look, we in the government and in industry consistently and almost to a T deliver. We deliver capabilities, and that doesn't mean it's not going to be a slog to get there, but I don't want to make any mistakes that when we call on the defense sector, when we call on industry, and when we call on our warfighters to do the impossible, they do it and deliver. So I want to start from the premise that all is not lost, and it's not that we can't do it, and it's not that because there was underinvestment in the 90s we can't catch up, right? None of that is true, and the enduring American advantage is this system that can produce. Now that I think then lends us to say, What does industry need to do, and what do we need to do to make that so? Let me start with the government side. On the government side, we've, as I mentioned, made a lot of investments into industry just in the last 2 years, but also over the last few years, right? And those include funding for munitions, for key missile systems, to increase production and facilitization of a number of priority munitions and weapon systems. In parallel to that, we're working on getting a more consistent and reliable demand signal for industry. So what does that mean? That means more multi-year procurements, in particular in key munition areas. You see that in the current defense bills. We're cautiously hopeful that Congress will agree with that. And that allows us to have hot production lines that are scalable and can expand. The third piece we discussed a little bit, but is making sure that we're not just self-solving at the expense of our broader other advantage, which is our network of allies and partners, and making sure that our overall strategy incorporates that capacity and also that demand, so that we have a broader economic ecosystem that is sort of a flywheel that allows greater production that integrates a range of supply chain elements.
Does it sustain?
Well, I think that question depends on what you mean by sustainable. The point of economic investments, the point of creating a free market rather than a state-owned set of enterprises, is that it is sustainable, right? We make the investments in facilitization, we have the contracts with the multi-years to create the longer-term demand, but ultimately we rely on the free market economic system to grow those capabilities, to deliver asymmetric emerging capabilities, and to do that at the scale that we need to when we need it. And I think that's kind of where, that's where the department is, and that's where I think you've really seen real gains over the last 2 years, and we'll continue to see it over the next several years.
So I'd like to pull one of the threads there, which is just on multi-year contracts, which are seen as important to incentivize prime contractors, but really help them send a signal to their subcontractors that subcontractors and the whole supply chain want to do business with the Department of Defense. That's a bell I've been ringing as much as possible, because it's not just about ensuring prime contractors have what they need, but making sure that the subs know that this is really important for them too. So we have one more question in the room, and I have one closing question, but we're out of time. So I'll ask mine, you ask yours, and then you can pick which you answer or
Dealer's
both.
choice.
So my final question is always, I work at a think tank. I worked at another think tank before this. What should the acquisition analysis community be focused on to really help the department understand the challenges? Where could we contribute? So that's my question. What are the big things we should work on? And please, sir.
Hi, Chris Scott with the Asia Times, and maybe my question can relate to yours. How do you balance the long timelines for a lot of these projects with the rapidly changing reality for warfighters? For instance, with let's say the replicator program, if laser defense makes drones obsolete, do you have a review process that will stop something soon enough that you can recoup or not waste more money and move on to what's needed next?
Yes, well, let me connect these threads. I think big picture, we need to do data-driven acquisition. We do that some, we can always do it more. And in particular, that means connecting concepts like tech readiness levels with acquisition readiness levels and integration risk to have a holistic picture as technology is kind of evolving. That picture has to involve the threat environment in a more systematic way. We do that some. We have review processes, and they review tech, and they review that tech in the context of warfighter requirements and the threat environment. We could almost surely do that more systematically, and having processes to do that is absolutely something we should work on. More generally, I think for the sort of acquisition research community, I would say there are two big areas that at least I would certainly welcome sort of continued engagements on. One is creative ways for us to think about exactly where our sort of friction, compression, inefficient points are, right? Like we can look inside of A&S, inside of acquisition programs we see, and we'll identify the things we can identify. We'll almost always miss things, and also we're very much looking through our sort of soda straw lens of what is within our DOD, executive branch, sometimes even just OSD authorities. And often there's a bigger picture out there, which is, hey, have you guys thought about, looking at this? Have you leaned into doing this? Is there a place where we can tie this international approach that's being used over here to here, an approach on procurement that's over here. And those ideas, that sort of broader context, is something that is just invaluable from researchers, informed researchers in the acquisition community. And the other piece is exactly this on connecting the threat environment to capabilities, which is we are focused on kind of identifying the capabilities we know and figuring out the ones that look like they match warfighter requirements and continuing to move those across the transom. We're doing that in a continuously evolving political threat and international environment. We can do our best to look at that through intelligence and through our own expertise, but there's really no substitute for expert analysts connecting that and making sure the department is understanding that, be it through analytic pieces, war games, exercises. All of those provide really valuable insights in, frankly, red teaming to our own thinking. And, as I said, this is a continuous improvement process, and that is an all hands on deck situation, and the research and analytic community plays an important role in that, in making sure we're kind of vectored in a broad sense and then in a narrow sense in the right direction.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And we are not only at time, but 2 minutes over. So if we could give Dr. Plumb a round of applause.